In today's video, I'm going to show you how to build an actually useful space station from scratch in under 10 missions in Kerbal Space Program. So let's jump right in to our first mission. We'll start out in the vehicle assembly building and begin by building one of my classic escape pods, which you may have seen in some of my other videos. To do this, we'll simply attach some RCS to it so it can move independently, and add some parachutes and a heat shield so it can return without problems no matter where we put our station. We'll also want a docking port on top so we can attach it to the station. Now let's build the core module. This is where all the other modules will dock, and it's where the first crew will spend their time. To do this, I add a large docking port beneath the heat shield of the escape pod to be used as a decoupler, and we'll also dock other modules to this later. I also add a probe core first so it's controllable, then optionally add an SAS module for additional control. You may also opt to add an RTS fuel tank here too, but I decided to go without it. Then we need to add a hitchhiker crew cabin, which is where our crew can stay. Now we can add the main docking port core. To do this, I place down a structural adapter and then attach a multi-point connector, putting a docking port on each of the nodes here. It's also a wise idea to add some batteries and some static solar panels so we don't ever run out of electricity. And optionally, you can add some lights to make it look nice, as I struggle to do here. From here, we can then encase the station core into a payload fairing, and optionally add a launch escape system on the top. Here we need to make sure to add a probe core to the upper stage so we can get it away from the station when we're done with it. Now from here we can just build a fairly conventional rocket that's powerful enough to get to our destination orbit. Because I'm only going to a fairly low Kerbin orbit, I only need a couple of kilometers per second of delta V, but you may need more depending on where you plan on putting it. But just like that, we're ready to launch. But before we launch, I want to quickly thank everyone over on the Kerbal Physics Patreon, with special thanks to Seek, AKGG, Luke and Jake Hughes, who have joined at the higher tiers. All your support helps make videos like this possible, so thank you all very much. Now, here I decide to put my station into a fairly high inclination orbit at 45 degrees, but you can put your station wherever you want. The only real reason I'm putting it in this awkward orbit is to demonstrate that it doesn't really matter where you put it, and you'll see why in future missions. Other than that, the launch is a fairly standard procedure. I decide to try to put my station into an orbit at around 250 kilometers above the surface, but again, you can put it wherever you think feels best. Once we've arrived at our destination orbit, we need to deorbit the upper stage that got us there, so we don't leave behind a mess. Lastly, we can detach the escape pod from the big docking port, and then redock with the station at the other end. But with that, you've now taken the first step to making an actually useful space station, so congratulations. We'll now start expanding it out in our next mission. For this mission, we're going to add a science and observation module to the station, so let's build our ship. I'm starting with a probe core and then adding an adapter on top of it, making sure to remove the fuel. On top of this, I then connect two science labs. I decided to add two here, but you might just want one. We then want to add an SAS module, and I also add a cupola pod at the top to provide a nice window for us to look out of. On the bottom, I then add a small monopropellant tank and some RCS thrusters to make sure that we can dock. We then want to add some batteries and some small solar panels. Lastly, I add some coloured lights to make it look nice. These aren't necessary, of course, as you can decorate your station however you like. And now, the science module is all ready. We can now encapsulate this payload in a large 3.5 meter fairing, making sure to add a probe core to the upper stage so we can deorbit it when we're done. For this, I just add an 8th size fuel tank and an adapter to fit on a skipper engine. I also add some Werner engines to the upper stage too, since the payload is so large, and these will also help with the deorbiting process later. After adding some solar panels, our upper stage is done. Now, because our upper stage is so efficient, we only need a fairly small launcher stage. Here I decide to add a large 3.75 meter tank and the Mammoth engine, with some fins for control and then auto-strutting everything. Lastly, I'm going to place a small antenna in the cargo bay of our cupola module to attach to the main body of the station, since I forgot to add one in the first mission. But with that, we're ready to launch. Now before we can launch, we need to wait until we pass under the orbit of the station, so that we can launch directly into its orbital plane. If you're not sure what this means, Check out my video on how to rendezvous with any target in an arbitrary orbit, which explains it in more detail. But put simply, this means that we won't need to waste fuel doing a massive inclination change burn when we're in orbit. We can then just proceed with standard rendezvous procedures. When we arrive, we can ditch the upper stage and deorbit it. We then want to right-click the docking port on the bottom of our ship and select Control from here. Then we can come in for a docking. I'm now going to perform our first EVA operation, getting an engineer to place the antenna that we brought on the outside of the habitation module. And that concludes mission number 2. For the next mission, we're going to add a fuel module to the station, so other ships can dock and get refueled there. So let's make a start. I start out with a 2.5 meter probe core and add a reaction wheel and a large battery. Then I add a large RCS fuel tank, which will keep fully fueled. Below this, I add a large 2.5 meter diameter fuel tank, but for this, we're going to remove all the fuel from it before we launch. Optionally, you might even want to add another reaction wheel on the bottom of this for better control. But then, we want to add 2 large docking ports on the top and on the bottom, as well as some RCS thrusters. Now, the fuel module is basically ready, so let's work on the upper stage. Like always, I add a probe core to the upper stage so that we can deorbit it when we're done. And here, I opt to use a quarter-sized tank with a Poodle engine, as well as some Werner engines to help with the deorbiting. Now, instead of putting all of this in a large fairing, I'm just going to place a big nose cone on the top, which will jettison using separatrons when we get to space. Here, it's important to add the separatrons to the nose cone asymmetrically, to ensure that we don't hit it when we detach it during ascent. Much like the last mission, we can once again build a small launcher stage, as our upper stage is fairly efficient. For this, I add an adapter to make the rocket wider, and then add a full-size 3.5 meter tank to power a Mammoth engine. But just like that, we're ready to launch. Now, just like last time, we're going to have to time our launch right to make sure that we launch into the same orbital plane as the station. But after we get into orbit, it's fairly standard rendezvous procedures. After ditching the upper stage, we can dock the module to the large docking port on the station, and with that, mission 3 is complete. Now for this next mission, we're going to add a solar array to the station, so let's jump right in. I'm going to start out with a probe core and add some SAS, RCS fuel, and a docking port on the top. We can then start building out a structural truss where the solar panels will go. At the bottom, I add the same stuff that's on the top, only instead of a probe core, I decide to add a battery. We then need some RCS thrusters on the top and bottom tanks so that we can dock. Now let's start adding the solar panels. For this specific configuration, I add 5 on each side, starting with the one in the middle, and then for each adjacent solar panel, I offset their rotation by 15 degrees, which is 1 click of the rotation wheel. This isn't for any particular reason other than to make it look interesting, so you might prefer to add different solar panels in a different configuration. It just depends on what you want it to look like. We can then place a decoupler on the bottom, and our first solar array is done. But now comes the interesting part. I'm adding a probe core to start the upper stage as usual, but this time I set it as the root part. This is because I'm then going to remove the solar panel array and duplicate it, so we can then add another one using symmetry. This way, we can launch both arrays at the same time, making it more efficient. To do this, I connect them to structural pieces placed symmetrically on the fairing. From here, I can then encase the payload in a fairing and then build out the rest of the upper stage, using a similar design to the one in mission 2. Also, like in that mission, the upper stage is very efficient, primarily because our payload is very lightweight. Because of this, I'm actually going to add an adapter to just use a 2.5 meter diameter launcher. While it may look somewhat goofy, it's just the right amount of fuel for the task at hand. But once we've fixed our staging, we're ready for launch. Now, as usual, we're launching into the plane of the station, but all of this should be fairly routine by now. However, here I tried to be careful, and I tried to take a slow and steady approach with my rendezvous and docking. This is so I would time it right so I arrive when I'm at Kerbin's daytime side, as I didn't want to dock on the nighttime side of the planet. But when I arrived, I realised that the station is already in permanent sunlight anyway. Regardless, we can now detach the solar arrays and ditch the upper stage and deorbit it. We then want to dock each array individually. Here I make sure to try to get the rotation of the arrays the same on each side, because who doesn't love a symmetrical solar panel array? Now comes the moment you've all been waiting for. Unfortunately though, there is a bit of clipping with the solar panels and the science module, but thankfully there's a simple fix for this. Just take a Kerbal out on EVA, making sure it's an engineer, and then just do this. But with that, Mission 4 is a success. Now in Mission 5, we're going to add a fuel production module to the station, so let's get to work. I'll start with a large 2.5 meter probe core, and then immediately add a large docking port on the top. We'll then add a reaction wheel and a large convertertron. This is what converts ore into usable fuel. Below this, we need to add a few large ore tanks for storage, and then a large monopropellant tank. After that, we can then add the bottom docking port and some RCS thrusters. Importantly, you need to add some radiators or thermal control units near the ore processor. This is because it has a tendency to overheat and explode, and these radiators will prevent that from happening. After remembering to add a big battery and some small solar panels, this module is now ready. We can now build a standard launch stage, and I use the same design as last time. The only difference is, I realise our Delta V is falling a bit short, so I add some boosters on the sides. However, I would recommend building a larger launch stage here if you have a bit less experience, as this really is cutting it tight. But just like that, we're ready for launch. Now the launch process should seem very standard at this point. We wait until we pass under the station's orbit, and then we launch into its plane. The only difference this time is that I find myself running a bit short on Delta V, which I'm sure absolutely no one saw coming. This is what I get for not taking my own advice and building a bigger launch stage. But thankfully, I can use the final bit of my fuel to deorbit the upper stage and actually complete the rendezvous just using RCS, even if it means overshooting the target a little bit. It's a good thing we brought so much RCS fuel, but once we get docked, we can finally deploy the radiators. Before we start our next mission, however, we're going to move around some of the modules that we already have. This is a crucial step towards making the space station actually useful. To start, we'll transfer a Kerbal to the escape pod, and then reattach it opposite to the science module. We can then undock the science module and attach it where the escape pod just was. You're probably wondering how this will make the space station actually useful, but you're going to find out in the next few missions. Now in this mission, we're going to launch the component that will actually make the space station actually useful, so watch closely. Because our payload is so large and complex, we're going to start by building the upper stage and launch vehicle first. Like always, I add a probe core to the upper stage, only this time I'm adding some RCS and a large docking port too, as well as some small static solar panels to make sure we can control it. I then add a large 5 meter fairing and just close it up for now. To make the upper stage, I add a half-size 5 meter fuel tank and then adapt it down to attach a skipper engine, making sure to add some RCS thrusters at the bottom. From here, we can build a fairly conventional 5 meter launch stage. We want to build this so that our entire vehicle has around 7 km per second of Delta V before adding the payload. But just like that, we're ready to launch. As usual, we're going to launch into the plane of the station and proceed with our usual rendezvous and docking procedures. With that, we now have the large upper stage attached to the station, giving us a method of moving it around. Do you remember in the first mission, when I said it doesn't really matter what orbit we put this station in? This is why. It's because we now want to plan a burn to Minmus using a standard Hohmann transfer. If you're not sure how to do Hohmann transfers to targets, check out my video on the Hohmann transfer angle formula, or perhaps just one of my Minmus guides. To do this from our inclined orbit, we want to burn at the ascending or descending node, but we need to wait for Minmus to align with the Hohmann transfer angle with respect to the nodes. Once we arrive at Minmus, we can circularize and bring ourselves into a nice, stable orbit, where our station will stay for now. At this point, you might even want to reconfigure the station to how it was before, if you so desire. But now that we've arrived and got set up, that concludes Mission 6. In the next mission, we're going to start wrapping up the construction and making the station actually useful. If you're enjoying this so far, please consider liking the video and subscribing so you don't miss another Kerbal Physics tutorial. So now, we're going to launch an ore miner to the station, which will provide it with the necessary resources to make fuel. So let's jump right in. I start by building an escape pod using the same design as seen in Mission 1. Below this, I then add 3 large ore tanks and a large RCS fuel tank, before placing a large docking port upside down on the bottom. Now on the sides, I add 2 pure liquid fuel tanks with no oxidizer. This is because I'm attaching nuclear engines, which don't need oxidizer to function. When you place these, it's important to make sure that the bottom of the engine's nozzle is above the docking port, so it doesn't hit anything when we try to dock. Now on the other sides, I add 2 small drills, making sure that they can reach the ground. Here, it's important to add radiators or thermal control systems nearby to make sure that they don't overheat and the drills can function properly. After adding some RCS thrusters, batteries, and solar panels, the lander is about ready. Before we continue with our build, it's a wise idea to add the solar panels, radiators, and drills to action groups so we can quickly deploy and retract them when needed. Now that that's done, we just need to build a conventional launcher with enough Delta V to get us out to Minmus. After adding some more boosters and auto-strutting everything, we're ready to launch. We're taking a fairly standard approach to Minmus here, but when we get there, we're going to land there directly without meeting the station first. When we arrive, I make sure to dispose of the upper stage so as not to leave a mess, and then land safely so we can begin mining. Keep in mind that mining can take a while, especially if you don't have an engineer on board. But when the ore tanks are full, we can then launch and transport this ore back to the actually useful space station, where it can be used to create fuel. We can then use this to refuel the lander and then go and collect more ore. We just need to do a few runs of this and then the fuel reserves will be full in no time. Then once it is full, we can safely say that Mission 7 is a success. Now for Mission 8, we're going to be rectifying a couple of mistakes that I made in the last mission, so we're going to build a new miner for the station. For this miner, we're going to start with a probe core because we don't want to send any more crew, but the design is almost identical to the last time. The key difference is that we're going to add a service bay full of science experiments in this miner. This is only really useful if you're playing in career or science mode, but as a sandbox enjoyer, I'm just adding it for immersion here. Inside this service bay, I stick as many experiments as I can in there, and also add some cargo holds where we can store surface experiments to place down when we're gathering the ore. Admittedly, when I first built this, I actually forgot the cargo containers, so I had to relaunch after getting all the way out to the station. This is suboptimal, so make sure not to do that. Inside the cargo containers, we're going to add an antenna, solar panels, some science experiments, and a few repair kits. You could also add some EVA experiments too. We can then build out the same design as with the previous miner, and then put this on a rocket capable of getting to the station. But just like that, we're ready for launch. We'll now take this miner all the way out to Minmus, and instead of landing like last time, we'll bring it to the station. But when we dock, we're going to attach it to the end of the solar panel array. If you want it to look especially nice, you can then take the other lander and attach it on the opposite end too. Now when we next need to refuel the station, we can take this improved lander and place down the science experiments during our next trip to the surface. But with that, our 8th mission is complete. At this point, our space station is now complete, and if you want, you can just leave it here as a refueling station. However, if you're feeling a bit more ambitious, as I was here, you can now relocate the station to another planet. I decided to try to take it out to Eve. To do this, we want to make sure that we're fully fueled and we've reattached the modules into the configuration that we had them when we first came to Minmus, as this will prevent us from spinning out of control. We'll then depart at the ideal phase angle, as it's really just like any other interplanetary transfer. But here's where you are going to learn from my mistakes. Here, I attached both of the landers on the solar panel arrays, but given that the landers are particularly heavy, it would be much wiser to detach them and fly them out to the destination independently. as I failed to do so here. As a result of this, when I arrive at Eve with both of the landers still attached, there is just enough fuel to get the station into orbit, and then bring the landers to Gilly to gather ore. But unfortunately, there just isn't enough fuel left to get the station there, and there also isn't enough fuel in the landers to bring the ore out to the station. So now we're left stranded here, and Mission 9 is a failure. So the way I see it, there's only one thing left to do. Thanks for watching. If you found this helpful, be sure to check out some of my other videos, and make sure to subscribe so you never miss another Kerbal Physics tutorial.